You open your eyes. There's no memory of how you got here. Only this place. The air is thick. It burns your lungs with every breath. There's no physical pain. Not yet. There's something worse. A perfect lucidity. You remember the sun, the sound of rain, and that memory is your first torment. Because deep in your soul, a cold truth settles in. This will not end. The nightmare you feel, is this what the Bible truly promised? This image is the one we all know. The rivers of fire imagined by Dante. The grotesque, tortured creatures born from Bosch's darkest dreams. A bottomless pit of endless suffering where every sin is punished with a unique and eternal cruelty. It's a powerful vision, almost alive in its ability to terrify us. It's been hammered into our collective consciousness for millennia, whispered in bedtime stories to frighten children, shouted from pulpits in fiery sermons, painted in excruciating detail on the ceilings of churches, a silent, everlasting warning to all who looked up. It became such a fundamental, unquestionable truth that doubting it feels like heresy. We simply accept the nightmare as fact. But what if the image we fear so deeply is only the most superficial layer of this story? What if it's actually a grand fabrication, a masterpiece of fear carefully built upon the shaky foundations of mistranslations, of metaphors taken literally? What if the real horror isn't in what was written, but in what was lost and added along the way? In the next few minutes, we'll do something few dare to attempt. We'll set aside the popular imagery and travel back to the origin of it all. We'll analyze the original words in their true context before they were filtered through centuries of translation and doctrine. This isn't a video about religion. It's an investigation into the anatomy of humanity's deepest fear. The goal, to answer a simple yet terrifying question. What does the Bible really say about what happens after the end? And our investigation begins with the first and oldest word for the afterlife, a word that appears 65 times in the Old Testament, long before any mention of a devil or a lake of fire. The word is Sheol, and what it truly means is not what you expect. Brace yourself, because here begins our first twist. Sheol. Before we go any further, I want you to do something. Close your eyes and imagine hell. What do you see? Fire? Lakes of sulfur? Horned demons with pitchforks? Endless screams echoing through eternity? Hold that image. Now, erase it completely from your mind. Because for over 1,000 years of biblical history, throughout the vast narrative of the Old Testament, none of that existed. The architecture of terror we just described had not yet been built. There was only one concept, one single, inevitable destination for every living soul. There was only Sheol. Often translated as pit, or grave, or realm of the dead, Sheol is the original homeland of shadows in Hebrew cosmology. But don't be mistaken, it wasn't a place of punishment. It was a place of absence. A realm of deep silence ruled by impenetrable darkness. The Bible describes it as the land of forgetfulness, a place where there is no work, no knowledge, no wisdom. It was the final democracy of dust. Kings and slaves, prophets and sinners, the righteous and the wicked all met the same silent end. When the patriarch Jacob believed his beloved son Joseph was dead, he lamented that he would descend to Sheol in mourning, not in torment, in sorrow. For the prophet Job, drowning in unbearable suffering, Sheol was seen as a welcome relief, a place to hide from life's pain, a sleep from which one does not wake. And here lies the true terror of the original concept. The fear wasn't of pain, it was of nothingness. There was no fire in Sheol because there was no sensation, no screams because there was no voice, no memory because your consciousness, your identity, everything that made you you, simply dissolved into dust. The torment wasn't eternal suffering. The torment was the eternal end of feeling, the end of love, of hate, of longing, of hope. Sheol was not punishment. It was the final period, a definitive, irreversible lights out, an echo fading into an endless, silent corridor. So, the primal fear of biblical humanity was never eternal suffering. It was absolute oblivion, a cold, silent end shared by everyone. The million-soul question is this: if for more than a millennium the fate of the dead was this vast, silent void, then where did the fire come? What happened that turned the still darkness of Sheol into the screams and gnashing of teeth we now associate with hell? The answer lies in a seismic shift of culture and language, in a time of great upheaval, and in a new word imported into the lexicon of terror, the name of a real, cursed, smoldering valley on the outskirts of Jerusalem, a valley of fire and refuse, called Gehenna.
For the audience listening to Jesus' sermons in the first century, this word was not an abstract concept or mystical dimension. It was a real place, a place they could see, smell, and above all, fear. To understand how fire entered the equation of life after death, we need to step outside the sacred texts for a moment and walk the dusty hills of ancient Judea. South of the walls of the holy city of Jerusalem, there was a valley, the Valley of Hinnom. In Hebrew, Gehenna. In Greek, Gehenna. This was no sacred place. It was the city's open wound, its profane scar. Centuries earlier, it had been the site of the darkest rituals, where apostate kings sacrificed their own children in fiery offerings to the pagan god Moloch. The place was cursed, stained by a memory of horror. By the time of Jesus, its purpose was more mundane, but no less repulsive. Gehenna had become Jerusalem's trash dump, an open-air landfill where all the city's filth was dumped. Animal carcasses, waste, and most importantly, the bodies of condemned criminals, denied a proper burial. And to consume this mass of corruption and prevent disease from spreading, a fire was kept burning, a fire that burned day and night. Imagine the scene. Perpetual smoke rising to the sky, the unbearable stench of decay and burning, the sight of worms and maggots writhing in the rot the fire had not yet reached. This was the scene every listener had in mind. So, when Jesus rose to teach and warned of the danger of being thrown into Gehenna, what was he really saying? Was he revealing for the first time the existence of a subterranean dimension of soul torture? Or was he using the most potent, visceral, and utterly terrifying metaphor his culture could conceive? He was pointing to the most despicable place they knew, a symbol of ultimate destruction, of oblivion, of total uselessness. To be thrown into Gehenna did not mean being preserved to suffer. It meant being treated like garbage, consumed, annihilated, erased from existence by fire and worms until nothing remained. It is in this context that other frightening expressions in the New Testament take on a new light. The weeping and gnashing of teeth does not necessarily describe endless torture, but anguish and regret in the moment of judgment, realizing what has been lost. Eternal fire does not mean a fire that burns souls forever, but a fire whose result is eternal and irreversible, complete destruction. The image of hell was changing. The cold silence of Sheol was being replaced by the hot, violent annihilation of Gehenna. But the language of terror did not stop there. The apostles and New Testament writers added even more layers to this growing nightmare, speaking of an endless abyss, of outer darkness, and of worms that do not die. Were these simply other ways to describe destruction, or clues that the final destiny was something even stranger and more complex than a simple end?
The journey to understand the biblical hell does not end with places like Sheol or Gehenna. It plunges deeper into a bestiary of symbolic images, allegories designed to strike at the most primal fears of the human soul. And the first, perhaps most repulsive of these images, is the worm that does not die. At first glance, the image is grotesque, a worm feeding on a body for all eternity. But the true essence of this horror is not physical pain. Remember Gehenna, the valley of refuse where worms consumed the rot the fire could not reach? The worm was a symbol of filth, of decay, of something that had reached the lowest, most despicable state of existence. A worm that does not die is not an external torment. It is an internal condition. It is consciousness, the soul, becoming the agent of its own decay. It is the image of perpetual regret, of shame that gnaws from within and never ceases. The horror is not being devoured by a worm. The horror is realizing you have become the worm, endlessly feeding on your own failures and regrets in an infinite cycle of self-destruction. But decay is not the only fear. There is a terror perhaps even older, the fear of losing control, of absolute solitude. And for this, the Bible uses two powerful images: the endless abyss and the outer darkness. The abyss is not just a deep hole. It is the representation of total loss of ground, of foundation. It is the sensation of perpetual falling into a darkness that never ends, with nothing to grasp. It is the suffocating panic of eternal instability, a vertigo that never ceases. And the outer darkness, this may be one of the most terrifying concepts. It is not merely the absence of light, it is the absence of everything. It is being cast out from warmth, from community, from life, from the presence of God. It is the soul's solitary confinement. It is in the cold and darkness of this cosmic isolation that the Bible says there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, not from fire, but from the overwhelming despair of total isolation and the realization of what has been lost forever. Finally, we return to fire, the unquenchable fire. After everything we have seen, we can now see it in a new light. In Gehenna, the purpose of fire was not to torture, it was to eliminate. The horror of this fire is not that it burns the soul forever. The horror is that its purpose is to eliminate, to purify the universe of you. It is a final sacred fire whose only aim is to disintegrate existence, to burn identity until only forgotten ashes remain. Worm, abyss, darkness, fire. They are not merely images of a future of suffering. They are a map of the darkest corners of our own minds, the fear of decay, of isolation, of loss of control, and of annihilation. But this raises an even deeper question. Why do these images, forged millennia ago, still resonate so powerfully? Why, even in our modern skeptical world, does their mere mention still send a shiver down the spine? The answer, as we will see, may not lie in theology, but in the very wiring of our brains, in the psychology of fear.
If the fear of hell is the perfect psychological lock, history shows us exactly who learned to forge and wield the key. Once early religious leaders and power structures understood the devastating effectiveness of this psychological weapon, the function of hell began to change. It ceased to be merely an eschatological destination and became a tool of spiritual, moral, and ultimately social control. The mechanism is brutally simple. It creates the ultimate dichotomy, a choice with the highest imaginable stakes. On one side, the promise of infinite reward, paradise. On the other, the threat of infinite punishment, hell. Faced with such absolute risks, the complexity of human morality is crushed. There are only two paths: obedience or damnation, salvation or torment. Imagine yourself in a dark church centuries ago, lit only by candles. The congregation is made up of people whose lives are short, brutal, and filled with suffering. And from the pulpit, a voice thunders, painting vivid images not of God's love, but of His wrath. It describes sinners as spiders, hanging by a thin thread over a fiery abyss, ready to be dropped at any moment. The purpose of such sermons was not to inspire, it was to terrify, to extract conformity through fear. The message was clear. Your life on earth is fleeting, but your choices here carry eternal consequences. And we are the gatekeepers of the path that spares you from the fire. This power did not stop at ensuring church attendance. The threat of hell became the foundation of power structures for over 1,000 years. It dictated laws, justified holy wars against those who, by not sharing the same faith, were already condemned. It fueled the fires of the Inquisition, where earthly torture was presented as a small price to pay for saving a soul from eternal torment. The fear of hell suppressed science, branding curiosity that challenged dogma as a sin worthy of the abyss. Hell became the great invisible force that upheld order. Kings ruled by divine right, and to rebel against the king was to rebel against God, a direct shortcut to damnation. It was the ultimate argument, the final threat that silenced dissent and secured the cohesion of empires. But empires fall and ideas evolve. With the Enlightenment, the rise of reason and science, the Church's monopoly on truth began to crumble. The threat of hell, though still potent, started to lose its grip as a tool of state control. Yet an idea that powerful does not vanish easily. Even as the authority of the pulpits waned, the image of hell had already escaped. It was so deeply rooted in our culture that it found new ways to survive and thrive. It infiltrated our art, haunted our literature, and eventually found its perfect home in our cinematic nightmares. Hell ceased to be merely a moral warning and became an inexhaustible source for our fascination with the macabre.
When an idea is so powerful that it becomes the central fear of an entire civilization, it cannot be contained within sacred texts or sermons. It escapes. It bleeds into culture, demanding to be seen, heard, and felt. Hell, once merely a tool of control, became the greatest muse of macabre art, and artists became its most devoted and terrifying architects. For centuries, the biblical hell was vague, a scattered collection of terrifying images with no structure. Then, in the early 14th century, an Italian poet named Dante Alighieri took those fragments and gave hell a geography. In his masterpiece, The Divine Comedy, Dante didn't just describe hell, he organized it. He gave it laws, levels, and a bureaucracy of suffering. The 9 circles of hell, each devoted to a specific sin, with a punishment that poetically mirrored the crime, the contrapasso. The lustful, swept away by their passions, are now driven forever by a violent storm. The gluttonous, who reveled in excess, now wallow in foul mud under freezing rain. And in the icy depths of the 9th circle, traitors do not burn, they freeze, trapped in a lake of ice, a cold punishment for cold hearts. Dante's vision was so influential, so imaginative, that it essentially replaced the biblical descriptions in the popular mind. The hell most of us imagine today is, in large part, Dante's hell. If Dante gave hell its structure, painters gave it its nightmares. Artists like Hieronymus Bosch plunged into the darkest corners of the psyche and returned with visions that defied sanity. In his works, hell is a surreal carnival of horror, demons that are hybrids of animals and machines, humans impaled on gigantic musical instruments, trees with human faces, and an entire landscape devoted to creative, bizarre torment. Bosch and others didn't just paint suffering, they painted madness, the total collapse of logic and natural order. They forced us to see the unspeakable. That fascination never vanished. It merely traded the painter's canvas for the silver screen. In the 20th century, hell became one of horror cinema's most enduring themes. From the sadomasochistic demons and their dimension of pain and pleasure in Hellraiser, to the cosmic chaos and psychological collapse of a spaceship that literally travels to hell in Event Horizon. Each generation reinvented the abyss to reflect its own fears. Hell became a mirror for our anxieties about pain, technology, the unknown, and the very nature of evil itself. Art didn't just depict hell, it expanded it, codified it, and made it even more terrifying, ensuring that even in an increasingly skeptical world,
it remains the richest landscape for exploring fear. Yet this journey through human imagination leaves us at a crossroads. If hell can be so many things, a silent void, a valley of fire, a labyrinth of 9 circles, a dimension of chaos, then what is it truly? A literal, physical place? A powerful metaphor for earthly suffering? Or a purely psychological state? A hell we build inside ourselves. Our journey has brought us here, to a crossroads haunted by an inevitable question. If hell can be a silent void, a valley of fire, Dante's labyrinth, or Bosch's nightmare, what is it fundamentally? The answer divides into 3 paths, 3 interpretations that coexist in our culture, each carrying its own unique kind of horror: the literal, the metaphorical, and the psychological. The first path is the oldest and most straightforward, the literal interpretation. For countless believers and theologians throughout history, hell is not a symbol, it is a place, a real and in some sense physical destination on the map of the cosmos, a realm of conscious and eternal suffering where the souls of the damned are sent after death and judgment. In this view, the biblical descriptions, as poetic as they may be, point to an objective truth. The fire, the darkness, the worms, all represent a real experience of torment. The horror here is one of inevitability, the fear of a place that exists regardless of belief, waiting patiently at the end of the line. The second path is the metaphorical one. A more liberal, modern perspective suggests that the language of hell was never meant to be a travel guide to the afterlife, but rather the only language strong enough to describe a spiritual truth. In this view, hell is not a place one goes to, but a state one reaches, the state of final and absolute separation from God, from goodness, from love, and from connection itself. The fire doesn't burn flesh, but sears the soul with unending regret. The darkness is not the absence of light, but the absence of hope. The torment is not inflicted by demons, but the conscience itself, forced to eternally confront its choices and the beauty of what was lost. The horror here is subtler, but perhaps deeper. It is the fear of self-inflicted suffering, of an inner collapse from which there is no escape. The third path brings us back to earth with terrifying urgency, the psychological interpretation. In this view, hell is not a posthumous destination, but a living condition. It is a metaphor for the depths of human suffering, paralyzing depression, the vicious cycle of addiction, corrosive guilt, maddening isolation. Hell is the prison of the mind itself. The demons are our traumas, our darkest impulses. The torment is the civil war waged within consciousness, here and now. The horror of this vision lies in its immediacy. Hell stops being a distant threat and reveals itself as a present reality for many. Literal, metaphorical, psychological. 3 visions, 3 forms of fear. But what if the truth is not choosing one over the others? What if the most terrifying possibility is that all 3 are true, facets of the same reality? What if hell begins as a psychological state we cultivate in life, crystallizes into a metaphoric torment of the soul after death, and manifests as something terribly literal beyond? That possibility forces us to face the single concept that binds all these visions, the pillar that upholds the entire architecture of terror, the one word that gives hell its absolute power and unbearable weight: eternity. We've reached the climax of our journey. It's time to look directly into the abyss, into the concept of eternal suffering.
Eternity. The word slides easily off the tongue, yet the human mind is incapable of grasping its meaning. Our brains were forged within the finite logic of time, to be born, to live, to die. Sunrise, sunset, the cycle of seasons. Everything we know comes to an end. Try for a moment to imagine what eternity truly means. Imagine a bird coming once every million years to take a single grain of sand from earth. When every beach, every desert, and the floor of every ocean is empty, when the entire planet is nothing but a smooth stone, not a single second of eternity will have passed. Now, take that scale of time and apply it to suffering. Hope is the mechanism that allows us to endure pain. We believe the illness will fade, that sadness will ease, that the night will eventually end. Hope is the promise of an after. Hell is the annihilation of hope, the annihilation of the very concept of after. The primary torment is not fire, it is not darkness, it is not the worm, it is knowledge. The lucid, absolute, unshakable certainty at every moment of consciousness that your current state will never, ever, under any circumstance change. Every second identical to the one before, and to the one after, and after, and after. The mind would, in an act of mercy, try to shatter itself, but here there is no mercy. Sanity is restored only to be lost again, and again, and again. Imagine for a moment the absolute solitude of outer darkness, the endless fall into the abyss, the inner shame of the worm that never dies, the agony of the fire that does not consume, all of it at once. A sensory and psychological assault from every front forever. There is no adaptation, no getting used to the pain, for it is renewed every instant by the memory of everything that was lost. In this state, there is no growth, no redemption, no learning. It is the perfect stagnation of the soul. A photograph of your worst moment turned into a sculpture of agony that lasts forever. The petrification of despair. It is the complete and total annihilation of the future. An existence frozen in the worst possible moment forever. Because if hell is real, there is no end to the torment.
We gazed into the abyss, and whatever it showed us, what remains is the feeling of a deep, lingering cold. Our journey began in the fire and chaos we thought we understood, but it led us down paths far older and stranger. We walked through the dusty silence of Sheol, the realm of forgetting. We felt the heat of the metaphorical fire of Gehenna, the valley of annihilation. We dissected the allegories that haunt our psyche and witnessed how fear was transformed into a tool of control. We saw the human imagination take that seed of terror and grow it into forests of artistic nightmares. After all this exploration, the question remains, more complex than ever. What is hell? Is it the literal fate awaiting the damned, a real place of eternal suffering? Is it a powerful metaphor for a life of spiritual separation and regret? Or is it a psychological state, the architecture of suffering we selves build within the walls of our own minds, here and now? The uncomfortable truth is that after millennia of debates, sermons, and nightmares, there is no final answer. Only the interpretation each of us chooses or is forced to accept. Hell remains the greatest of mysteries, shrouded in the shadows of death. But perhaps, in the end, the most important question isn't whether hell is real. Perhaps the question is why this idea never leaves us. Maybe we need it as the ultimate expression of our craving for justice in a universe that so often feels unjust, as the final destination for evil that escapes punishment in life. Hell may be humanity's darkest mirror, reflecting not only our fear of pain, but our deep understanding of our own capacity for cruelty. So here remains the final thought to haunt your quiet hours. Is hell merely the most enduring and terrifying myth we ever told ourselves, or the sober reality that waits at the end of all things? Our investigation ends here, but the conversation continues. Which vision of hell frightens you the most? Which interpretation resonates with you? The space for debate is open. Share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for joining us on this journey to the very end.